They say when the knocking stops, you should feel relief. But what if silence isn't safety? What if it means something far worse has taken its place? For weeks, there were 3 knocks at the door every night, always at midnight, always patient. And then one evening, the sound vanished, replaced by a pale, smiling face watching from the window. It doesn't knock anymore. It doesn't move. It doesn't blink. It just waits. Tonight, we're unraveling the terrifying account of what happens when the knocking stops, but the presence remains. As the days bleed together and the face draws closer, the line between inside and out begins to blur. Stay with us, because once you see the smile, it never really lets you go. The first night it came, the sound was so soft, he thought it was nothing. Just the house settling, or a stray branch brushing against the siding. It was late, sometime past midnight, when 3 distinct knocks echoed through the front door. They weren't loud or frantic. They were deliberate, patient, like someone waiting politely to be let in. He sat up in bed, staring at the ceiling as his ears strained in the darkness. 3 knocks, silence, then nothing but the hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the faint tick of the clock on his nightstand. He told himself not to overthink it. Old houses made noises. Maybe a neighbor had the wrong door, drunk or lost. He forced himself to lie back down, pulling the covers tighter around his shoulders. Yet the sound lingered in his mind like a splinter, sharp and intrusive, keeping his thoughts tangled until exhaustion finally dragged him under. By morning, it felt like a dream, one of those odd midnight moments you forget as daylight pours in. But as he sipped his coffee and scrolled absently through his phone, a strange unease curled in his stomach. He didn't remember dreaming. So why did the memory of those 3 knocks feel so vivid, so real? The second night, he wasn't asleep when it happened. He'd stayed up later than usual, watching some meaningless show on TV to drown out the quiet that seemed thicker than normal. When the clock hit midnight, his thumb hovered over the remote, ready to shut everything off and retreat to bed. That's when he heard it again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. His body stiffened, and he muted the TV without thinking. The house seemed to hold its breath, every creak of the floorboards amplified tenfold. He set the remote down carefully, as if the sound might trigger a response from whatever waited outside. The knocks hadn't been forceful, yet they carried a strange weight. He couldn't bring himself to approach the door. Instead, he sat motionless, listening for footsteps on the porch, the crunch of gravel in the driveway, anything. But there was only silence, oppressive and suffocating. He told himself to get up, to check the peephole, to laugh it off as nothing. But he didn't move. Something deep in his gut warned him not to. By the end of the week, the pattern had cemented itself. 3 knocks every night, midnight, never earlier, never later. The precision of it was almost worse than randomness. He started staying up on purpose, sitting in his darkened living room with the lights off, waiting for the inevitable sound. Sometimes it came sooner, sometimes closer to 12:30, but it always came, and always in 3s. Tap, tap, tap. His sleep suffered, his appetite waned. His phone sat neglected on the coffee table, buzzing occasionally with notifications he no longer cared to check. He told no one. Who would he even tell? What could he say that something knocked on his door every night, and he was too terrified to open it? They'd laugh, or worse, they'd believe him and expect answers he didn't have. He began avoiding the front door during the day as well. skirting the entryway like it radiated some invisible danger. The knocking grew louder on the 8th night. Not enough to wake a neighbor, but enough to rattle the thin glass in the door's small decorative window. He flinched at the sound, heart racing, as he stood in the hallway, staring at the shadowed outline of the door. The house felt smaller, as though the walls were inching inward with each passing second. He held his breath, waiting for the sound to come again, and when it did, 3 sharp raps spaced 5 seconds apart. His stomach twisted violently. He wanted to shout, to demand who was there, but his throat was tight and dry. Instead, he crept backward until his calves hit the couch, sinking down with shaking knees. He waited, ears ringing with silence, so heavy it felt like it might crush him. Minutes passed, then hours. Eventually, dawn crept in through the blinds, thin and pale. He dared a glance at the door before retreating upstairs. No marks, no footprints, just emptiness. On the 9th night, the knocking didn't come at midnight. He waited, perched on the edge of his bed, fingers digging into his knees. The house was dead quiet, the clock on the dresser ticking louder than usual. 12:30 came and went. Then 1 a.m. He should have been relieved. Instead, dread pooled in his chest, like a thick, black tar. What if the pattern had changed? What if it no longer needed to announce itself? As the minutes bled into hours, he couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted. The air felt heavier. The shadows seemed deeper. He swore he heard faint creaks in the walls, as if the house itself were breathing. When exhaustion finally won, his sleep was shallow and dreamless, yet he woke feeling more drained than ever. The 10th night, he fortified the door. He dragged a chair from the kitchen and wedged it under the knob, though he knew it wouldn't do much. He even piled a stack of boxes against it, telling himself the effort might at least slow whatever waited outside. Midnight came, no knocks. The silence didn't comfort him. Instead, it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff in thick fog, knowing there's a drop, but not how far. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, every muscle tensed as he waited for some sign, some sound. None came, not even the usual noises of a house settling. Only oppressive, unnatural quiet. He didn't remember falling asleep, but when he woke, the chair was no longer wedged under the knob. It stood neatly to the side, as though someone or something had moved it. On the 11th day, he noticed the footprints, faint, almost imperceptible smudges on the porch. Bare feet, long narrow toes splayed in a way that didn't look quite human. They started at the steps and stopped directly in front of the door. No return prints, just a single set of tracks that ended abruptly, like the thing had vanished. He didn't open the door to check. Instead, he retreated to the kitchen and sat trembling at the table, staring at the clock as it crept toward evening. He knew then that the knocking wasn't over. Whatever had been outside had simply grown tired of asking. By the 12th night, the silence had grown louder than any knock. He told himself to be grateful, to take comfort in the absence of sound, but it wasn't comfort he felt. It was something else, something heavy and electric, crawling under his skin like ants. The quiet didn't feel natural. It felt like waiting, the kind of stillness that comes when a predator is crouched in the grass, watching its prey. He moved through the house cautiously, flinching at every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the pipes. Even during the day, he felt watched. It was a feeling that clung to him like a second shadow, tightening around his throat until his breath came shallow and quick. He kept telling himself he was imagining it, but deep down he knew better. The 13th night, he dared to sit near the living room window, peeking through the gap in the blinds. Outside, the world looked calm and ordinary. Streetlights pooled yellow light on empty sidewalks. A stray cat darted across the road, and nothing stirred on his porch. Midnight came and went. No knocks, no movement. He stayed there for hours, staring at the glass until his eyes ached. It was only when he stood to leave that he saw it. A pale face hovering just beyond the window, eyes impossibly wide, mouth stretched into a grin too large to be human. His stomach lurched violently as he met its gaze. The eyes didn't blink, the grin didn't twitch, it didn't move at all. It simply stared as though it had been waiting for him to notice. For what felt like an eternity, he stood rooted to the spot, his heart thundering in his chest, so loudly he was sure it could hear. The face didn't press closer or make any sound. It just hung there, suspended in the night, its expression locked in place. He forced himself to step backward, his movements slow and deliberate. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to obey. When he finally reached the hallway, he darted upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind him and locking it with shaking hands. He curled up in bed, eyes fixed on the shadowy crack beneath the door, certain he would see pale fingers sliding through at any moment. But the night dragged on in silence. No footsteps, no creaks, just the memory of that grin burned into his eyelids every time he blinked. The next morning, he found himself standing at the window again, though he had no memory of walking there. Outside, there was nothing but the streetlight's long shadows and the faint rustle of leaves. He checked the glass for smudges, for any trace of its presence, but there was nothing, not a single mark. Maybe it had been a hallucination, a product of sleep deprivation and fear. That's what he told himself as he taped blankets over every window in the house, sealing out the light. But even as he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, that somewhere, behind those thin sheets of fabric, wide eyes still watched, and a grin still waited. That night, he tried sleeping with his head under the covers like a child hiding from monsters. It didn't help. He woke at 3:17 a.m. to the sensation of cold air brushing his face. The blankets had slipped down just enough for his eyes to catch a faint outline through the gap in the window covering. A pale, smiling face hovering inches from the glass. His breath hitched. He couldn't scream, couldn't move. His body felt pinned beneath a weightless pressure, like the thing outside had reached into his room without touching him. The face didn't blink. It didn't breathe. It only stared, its grin so wide, now it seemed to split its skin. When he finally dared to move, the face vanished like smoke, but a faint, foggy handprint remained on the glass, 5 long fingers splayed inhumanly wide. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. Instead, he sat trembling in the corner, clutching his phone, though he didn't know who he would call. He couldn't explain what was happening, not in a way anyone would believe. And even if they did, what could they do? By the 15th day, he stopped looking out windows altogether. He moved through the house with blankets drawn tight around his shoulders, careful to avoid even glancing at the reflective surfaces he'd once ignored. But he still felt it, that unrelenting gaze pressing against his skin, following him from room to room, waiting for him to slip up. He began to wonder if the knocking had only been a warning, a courtesy before something far worse settled in to stay. By the 16th night, he had stopped sleeping altogether. Every sound made his skin prickle. The floorboards seemed to sigh beneath invisible weight, and faint clicks echoed from inside the walls, as if tiny bones were breaking in slow succession. Even in daylight, he walked the house with hesitant steps, gripping a kitchen knife, though he wasn't sure why. He had no plan to fight. He barely had a plan to survive. It felt like he was being herded, cornered into smaller and smaller spaces. He'd sealed every window with blankets, towels, and duct tape, but he could still feel it, somehow on the other side, pressed so close he could almost hear its grin. The 17th night was worse. He woke to faint tapping, not at the door but at his bedroom window. 3 delicate taps, spaced 5 seconds apart. He froze beneath the covers, holding his breath. Slowly, the tapping started again. Tap, tap, tap. Then a pause. He didn't want to look, but some masochistic impulse forced him to. He peeled back the blanket, just enough to catch a sliver of glass through a gap in the covering. And there it was, the face. Its eyes were still wide, unblinking, reflecting no light. The grin was unchanged, as though carved into stone. But this time, its forehead pressed gently against the glass, leaving a faint, oily smear. The tapping had stopped. It didn't need to knock anymore. It had his full attention. Minutes stretched into hours as he lay there, muscles screaming from tension. Every time he blinked, he half expected it to vanish, to dissolve like a hallucination. But when his eyes opened again, it was still there, waiting, staring, smiling. His phone sat just out of reach on the nightstand, but he didn't dare move to grab it. He was certain that any sudden movement would provoke something he wasn't ready to see. He tried to think of what to do if the glass broke, if it decided to enter. He couldn't picture anything but paralysis. By the time sunlight began bleeding through the gaps in the curtains, the face was gone. It didn't fade or retreat. One moment it was there, and the next the window was empty. He didn't feel relief, only a crushing certainty that its absence meant nothing. It wasn't leaving. It didn't need to. It was patient. It could wait forever. On the 18th day, he stopped going near windows completely. He kept his head down and shuffled from room to room like a prisoner in his own home. His phone had died days ago. He didn't bother charging it. He no longer checked the time. The cycle of night and day had blurred into one unending stretch of fear and anticipation. Sometimes, in the corner of his vision, he thought he saw it, reflected in the blank screen of his dead television, in the glossy surface of the kitchen counter, even in the sheen of water pooling in the bathroom sink. Always smiling, always waiting. The 19th night, he awoke to find the blankets over his windows torn down. Not all of them, just enough to leave thin vertical slits of exposed glass. Moonlight streamed through the openings, silvering the room in eerie streaks. He didn't remember pulling them down. He didn't think he had. His throat felt raw, as though he'd been screaming in his sleep. When his eyes darted to the largest gap, his stomach twisted violently. The face stared back at him. Closer this time, so close he could make out the fine cracks in its cheeks. The way the grin seemed almost stitched in place. It didn't blink. It didn't breathe. It simply waited for him to move. He didn't. He couldn't. He lay there with his eyes locked on it until dawn. When sunlight filled the room, he found himself gripping the bedsheet so tightly. His knuckles ached. The face was gone again, but the memory of its grin felt heavier than anything he'd ever carried. The 20th day began like all the others, in silence. But it wasn't the comforting kind of quiet he used to crave in his busy life. This silence was oppressive, heavy like a thick fog in his chest. He shuffled through the house with dull eyes, every movement robotic, every thought fogged with exhaustion. He hadn't eaten in over 24 hours, hadn't showered in days. It didn't matter. Nothing did anymore. The face hadn't returned last night, or maybe it had, and he simply hadn't noticed. He was too afraid to check the windows now, but even without seeing it, he felt it. Felt those eyes fixed on him, felt that grin stretching wider with every hour that passed. He had started speaking to it without realizing, muttering under his breath as he walked, whispering to unseen corners, pleading with it to stop. But there was no response, not a sound. Only that suffocating silence that seemed to press harder the longer he waited. That night, he tried something different. He locked himself in the bathroom, the only room with a frosted window small enough to cover with a single towel. He sat on the cold tile floor, back against the tub, clutching a rusted wrench he had found under the sink. He wasn't sure what he planned to do with it. The silence throbbed in his ears, each tick of the clock on the counter, an unbearable reminder that time was still moving while he was stuck. Hours passed. His eyelids grew heavy. He began to doze, only to jerk awake at the faint sound of breathing. Not his own. It was coming from the window. Slow, steady, wet. His grip on the wrench tightened, knuckles cracking. He didn't want to look. He couldn't, but some primal instinct forced him to glance up at the small frosted pane. Through the thin towel, he saw an outline, a head, perfectly still, perfectly waiting. Then came a faint tap, not a knock, but the lightest touch. His stomach turned as the breathing grew louder, fogging the fabric. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing it to vanish. When he opened them again, the shadow was gone. But on the towel, a faint, wet mark in the shape of a handprint had bloomed. On the 21st day, he stopped trying to hide. He sat in the living room on the floor, staring at the blank TV screen. His reflection stared back at him, pale and haggard, eyes sunken and rimmed red. But then he noticed something else in the glass. Behind him, the faintest hint of white. A grin. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He knew it was there. Closer now. Closer than it had ever been. The thing no longer needed glass to separate them. Somehow, impossibly, it was inside. He felt its presence like a hand around his throat, cold and firm. That night, he dreamed again. He stood in his kitchen, all the windows uncovered, every pane filled with identical faces grinning at him, hundreds of them, the smiles stretched too far, eyes wide and wet, pressing against the glass in silent unison. As he turned in the dream, the faces followed, their movements perfect and synchronized. When he opened his mouth to scream, no sound came out, just a low, rasping laugh that wasn't his own. He woke gasping, clutching at his throat, convinced for a moment that hands were still wrapped around his neck. On the 22nd day, he found the front door standing open, wide open. Morning sunlight streamed through, illuminating dusty air. He didn't remember unlocking it. His stomach churned as he approached, the open doorway yawning like a mouth, ready to swallow him whole. Outside, the street was empty, but the air felt wrong, thick and too still. He didn't step past the threshold. Instead, he slammed the door shut and locked every bolt, then pushed the couch back against it. It didn't matter. He knew the locks wouldn't keep it out. They probably never had. That evening, the power went out. Not in the neighborhood, just his house. One moment, the lights flickered. The next, they died completely. He lit a single candle and sat in the corner of his bedroom, staring at the door. Hours passed. His mind slipped in and out of focus. He wasn't sure if he was awake or dreaming when he saw the faint outline of fingers curling around the edge of the doorframe. 5 long digits, pale and thin, too long to be human. They gripped the wood gently, lovingly, as though savoring the moment. Then the grin followed, wide, wet, unmoving. He could feel its eyes even in the pitch dark, drilling into him like nails. As the candle flickered low, his breath came in ragged bursts. He whispered to himself, over and over, "It can't come in. It can't come in." But deep down, he knew he was wrong. The knocking had only ever been a courtesy, a warning. The thing outside didn't need permission anymore. When the flame finally died, the grin was the last thing he saw. The house felt different now. It wasn't just the silence or the stillness. It was the sense of being watched from within. Every room seemed heavier, as if the walls themselves were leaning inward, listening, waiting. He hadn't seen the face since that final night when the candle burned out. But its absence didn't bring relief. Instead, it was worse. He felt it in the air, in the shadows pooling in corners where light should reach. It wasn't outside anymore. It was here, somewhere in the house, watching, waiting, smiling. He tried to leave. On the morning of the 23rd day, he packed a small bag and approached the front door, but the moment his hand touched the knob, a cold dread gripped his chest. He couldn't move, his body locked up, and his breath caught, as if an unseen hand had cinched tight around his lungs. He backed away slowly, heart thundering, feeling the faintest sense of amusement radiating from the shadows. It didn't want him to leave. No, this house wasn't a home anymore. It was a cage, and the thing inside wasn't finished with him yet. Nights bled into days with no distinction. He stopped keeping track of time. He unplugged the clocks, smashed his phone against the floor, and let the curtains hang in tatters. But even with no sense of time, he knew when it was midnight. It was the weight in his chest that told him, the thickening of the air, the faint electric hum in the walls like static ready to burst. That was when he heard it, breathing, soft, shallow, wet. It wasn't coming from outside. It was here, somewhere close. The sound drifted from room to room, like it was pacing, exploring, savoring the space, as if it belonged to it now. The 24th night, he slept on the floor of the hallway, clutching the rusted wrench like a talisman. He woke to a soft creaking sound, floorboards shifting under weight that wasn't his own. His eyes darted to the stairs. At the top, just visible in the dim light, was a figure, not fully formed, just a faint silhouette with 2 long limbs and a head cocked unnaturally to one side. The grin was unmistakable, stretching impossibly wide even from a distance. He froze, breath caught in his throat as the figure took one step down, then another, each movement slow and deliberate, like it was savoring his terror. He squeezed his eyes shut, muttering prayers he didn't believe in anymore. When he opened them again, the stairs were empty, but the sound of breathing was closer. By the 25th day, his mind had begun to splinter. He saw flashes of the face in reflections, water pooling in the sink, the blade of the kitchen knife, the black screen of the dead television. Once he caught his own reflection smiling back at him, lips stretched too wide, eyes hollow. He smashed the mirror with his fist, but even then, he swore he saw the grin lingering in the cracks of the glass. He no longer trusted himself or the house. or reality. Everything felt wrong now. Too quiet, too still. That evening, he heard a sound that sent ice through his veins. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't breathing. It was laughter. Soft, rasping, like someone trying not to choke while they chuckled. The sound drifted from the kitchen to the hallway, then up the stairs. It was everywhere. Nowhere. Inside his skull, he pressed his hands to his ears, but it didn't help. The laughter wasn't in the air. It was in him, burrowed deep like a splinter that had reached his bones. By the 26th night, he stopped running. He stopped hiding. He sat in the living room in total darkness, his back pressed to the couch, wrench loose in his lap. He could feel it now behind him, standing so close he thought he might feel its breath. But there was no breath, only silence. And then, slowly, a voice. It spoke his name, not loudly, not in a growl or a shriek. It was calm, cheerful, almost. "You let me in." The voice didn't speak again after that first time. It didn't need to. The two sentences it whispered clung to him like oil, seeping into his thoughts, staining every quiet moment. "You let me in." He didn't remember when. He didn't remember opening the door, but maybe that didn't matter. Maybe letting it in wasn't something physical. Maybe it had been enough for him to hear the knocking, enough for him to wait and wonder, enough for him to believe. Whatever it was, it had crossed some invisible line. It was here now, not outside, not in the walls, inside him. The house had changed too. It was subtle at first, the faint scent of rot that seemed to drift through the air, the creak of floorboards under weight that wasn't his own. Then it became more overt. The doors no longer led to the same rooms. He would open the kitchen door and find the stairs instead. He would climb the stairs and step into the bathroom. The layout shifted when he wasn't looking, as if the house had started breathing, reshaping itself around him. Sometimes he thought he heard whispers behind the walls, his own voice repeating words he didn't remember saying. "You let me in." Over and over. On the 27th day, he tried to leave again. He didn't pack a bag this time. He didn't grab shoes or a coat. He simply walked to the front door and flung it open, determined to run. But beyond the threshold was no street, no sky, no neighbors' houses, just an endless black void stretching in all directions. The air beyond was thick and heavy, pressing against his skin like water. As he stared, faint shapes began to emerge in the darkness. Faces, dozens of them, pale, smiling, unblinking. Their grins twitched in unison as they watched him. He slammed the door and staggered back, heart pounding in his ears. The laughter started again, low and wet, echoing from everywhere at once. That night, he heard it breathing beside his bed. Not across the room, not in the corner, right there, inches from his ear. The sound was slow and deliberate, as though it wanted him to know it wasn't in a hurry. He didn't open his eyes. He didn't need to. The air carried its presence, a damp, sweet rot, a faint static charge that raised the hair on his arms. He stayed perfectly still, convinced that movement would be a mistake. Hours passed this way, the sound of its breathing never faltering. When sunlight finally bled through the curtains, the sound stopped. But he could feel it hadn't left. By the 28th day, he was no longer sure what was real. His reflection didn't match his movements anymore. It grinned when he didn't, tilted its head at odd angles like it was trying to study him. Once, he caught it mouthing words silently. He couldn't hear them, but he didn't need to. He knew, "You let me in." He shattered the mirror with the wrench, but the pieces scattered across the floor still held fragments of that grin. Dozens of tiny mouths all smiling back at him. That evening, the walls began to hum, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through his bones. He pressed his hands to his ears, but it didn't help. The hum wasn't in the air, it was inside him. The house felt alive now, every creak and groan like joints stretching after a long sleep. He pressed his back to the corner of the living room, clutching the wrench, rocking slightly, as he whispered to himself. He didn't notice at first that his whisper wasn't alone. A second voice joined his own, repeating the words in perfect unison, but in a tone far too sweet. "Don't fight it. You let me in." By midnight, the laughter returned, louder this time, bubbling up from the floorboards, oozing from the walls, echoing in his skull, until it was all he could hear. His hands shot to his head, fingers digging into his scalp as he screamed for it to stop. But it didn't. It only grew louder, almost joyous. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. And the silence that followed was worse. In that silence, he heard it speak again, soft and clear, from right behind him. "We don't knock anymore." The words echoed long after they were spoken, slithering through his mind, like vines tightening around his thoughts. "We don't knock anymore." He sat frozen on the floor, staring at the blank television screen across the room. It reflected a faint silhouette behind him, tall and thin with a grin that seemed to pulse faintly in the glass. He wanted to turn, to confront it, but his body wouldn't move. His muscles trembled, locked in place, like they belonged to someone else. The reflection tilted its head slowly, curiously, its grin stretching wider until it nearly split its face in two. He felt warm tears spill down his cheeks as a quiet voice whispered in his ear, not from the room but from inside his skull. "You don't need to see me. I'm already here." The house was no longer familiar. Doors led to endless hallways now, each step deeper into a labyrinth of shifting walls and impossible angles. He stumbled through the darkness one afternoon, convinced he'd find the kitchen, only to step into a room lined with mirrors. His own face stared back 100 times over, except not all of them moved when he did. Some grinned when he didn't, their teeth too white, their lips too thin. Others blinked out of sync, or didn't blink at all. One reflection leaned close to the glass, whispering words he couldn't hear. Then it raised a finger to its lips, in a shushing motion, and smiled. That night, the laughter returned, louder and closer, like dozens of voices pressing against the walls. It was no longer coming from a single place. It was all around him, above, below, inside. He pressed his hands to his ears until his nails dug into his scalp, but it didn't help. The laughter wasn't sound anymore. It was a vibration in his bones, a resonance in his chest that made his ribs ache. The house seemed to tremble in response, floorboards quivering, windows rattling as if the entire structure had become its throat. And then a single voice rose above the cacophony, clear and gentle. "Why are you fighting? You let me in." On the 29th day, he stopped resisting. He no longer avoided mirrors or covered the windows. He sat in the middle of the living room, hands loose in his lap, eyes glazed as he watched faint shapes move through the walls. He saw outlines pressing against the plaster, long spidery fingers dragging across the surface, faces peering with unblinking eyes. They didn't break through, they didn't need to. The house itself had become their skin. He felt them beneath the floorboards, the faint thrum of their movement, like insects scuttling just under the surface. He whispered to himself, over and over. I'm not real. None of this is real. But the grin forming in the shadow of the doorway said otherwise. That evening, he tried to stand, but his legs refused to cooperate. His body felt alien now, sluggish, heavy, as though gravity had doubled. He felt a warm breath against his ear and realized he wasn't alone. A pale hand brushed his shoulder from behind, its fingers too long, its touch too cold. Slowly, he turned his head. The face was inches from his own. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The grin conveyed everything. Ownership, triumph. It had waited patiently for so long, and now it didn't need to wait anymore. When he woke the next morning, he was lying in bed, though he didn't remember climbing into it. His sheets smelled faintly of rot. The walls pulsed with a slow rhythm, like the beat of a giant heart. And then he heard it, breathing, steady and measured. But this time it wasn't coming from outside or beside him. It was in perfect sync with his own. By the 30th night, he understood the truth. It had never been outside. Not really. The knocking, the face in the window, the laughter, they were invitations, yes, but not for entry, for recognition, for belief. He had believed, and that was enough. Now when he looked in the mirror, it wasn't his face that stared back. It was the grin, wide and wet, stretching further with each passing hour. And when it spoke in his voice, he realized he couldn't remember how his own laughter used to sound. By the 31st day, he no longer felt hunger, or thirst, or fatigue. His body moved because it was told to, not because it wanted to. He wandered the shifting halls of the house, like a marionette on invisible strings, each step measured, deliberate. The air was thick with rot and sweetness now, a sickly perfume that clung to his skin. Sometimes he heard whispers in the walls, voices murmuring in unison. "We see you. We know you. You are us." He wanted to scream, but his throat wouldn't cooperate. He wanted to cry, but his eyes were dry. Only the grin remained, growing wider, heavier, until it felt carved into his face. That night, the walls began to breathe. He felt the soft rise and fall beneath his palms, the faint sound of air rushing like lungs filling and emptying. The floor pulsed with a heartbeat so deep it rattled his teeth. He stumbled into the kitchen and found the appliances melted into the walls, their shapes bulging like tumors under thin skin. Faces pressed against the plaster here too, dozens of them, their smiles wide and familiar. He recognized each one, his own, over and over. They grinned at him, unblinking, as their mouths whispered in perfect harmony, "You let us in." He tried to retreat upstairs, but the staircase stretched impossibly long, each step bending and twisting until it led nowhere. Shadows gathered at the edges of his vision, shifting like liquid, and then he saw it, his reflection, walking beside him, though there was no mirror. Its grin was wider than ever, teeth glistening wetly in the dim light. It didn't blink, it didn't speak. It only leaned close, their noses nearly touching, and whispered in his voice, "You're ready now." On the 32nd morning, he woke on the floor in the center of the living room. The house was silent again, the walls no longer pulsing, the air no longer vibrating, but something was different. He sat up slowly, his joints stiff, his skin cold. When he brushed his fingers against his cheek, they came away wet and sticky. Blood? No, not blood. Something darker, thicker. His grin widened without his permission. It felt natural now, like breathing. He didn't need to fight it anymore. The thing in the house wasn't separate from him. It never had been. The laughter returned at dusk, not loud this time, but low and intimate, like someone chuckling into his ear. He didn't flinch. He didn't run. He simply sat in the dark and smiled, listening as dozens of voices joined in, layered and harmonious. It wasn't frightening now. It was comforting, warm. The sound surrounded him, filled him, until he wasn't sure where his thoughts ended, and theirs began. By midnight, the house had gone silent again. He stood before the front door, staring at its warped wood. Slowly, it began to open, not outwards, but inwards, folding into the shadows like water retreating from a shore. Beyond the threshold, he saw a street, a neighborhood, familiar, ordinary, but he knew better. The faces watched from every window, their grins faint but unmistakable. He stepped outside barefoot, the cold air wrapping around him like a welcome embrace. As he walked into the street, his grin stretched impossibly wide, splitting his cheeks until dark fluid dripped onto the pavement. He felt the others behind him, their footsteps soft, their smiles radiant in the moonlight. Together they moved from house to house, pausing at each door, and then, with perfect unison, they raised their hands and knocked 3 times, slow, deliberate, waiting. The first house wasn't prepared. It didn't matter if they were or weren't, but this one felt especially vulnerable. No prayers muttered in shadowed rooms, no desperate salt lines across windowsills, no chalk symbols to hold back the inevitable, just quiet, suffocating, fragile quiet, broken only by the faint, trembling breaths of those within. He stood on the porch with bare feet pressed to the cold boards, his grin stretched so wide, his lips cracked faintly at the corners. Behind him came the others, gliding soundlessly like a shadow unfolding across the earth. Their eyes reflected nothing of the dim light, their movements slow and synchronized, dripping with something like reverence. Together they leaned into the silence, listening, hearts beat frantically on the other side of the door. A baby whimpered, small, fragile, unknowing. The sound made his grin tighten, skin pulling almost painfully over his cheeks. He raised a pale hand, fingers too long, and brushed it against the brass door handle. It turned easily under his touch. No locks engaged, no barriers left. The door opened inward with a sigh, wood groaning as if tired of holding the line. The family inside didn't know yet, but the knocking had already stopped for a reason. The others drifted in behind him, silent as ash, their footsteps leaving no sound but somehow pressing down on the air, making it heavy enough to choke. The house seemed to inhale as they entered, its windows fogging faintly, as though reacting to the shift in presence. He walked across the hardwood floor, the grin etched permanently across his face as his long fingers traced along the walls. A family photo greeted his touch, smiling parents, 2 children framed in the innocence of a better time. His nails scraped down the glass, splitting the image into distorted halves. From somewhere upstairs came a faint creak of a floorboard, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the heavy air. The father's hushed voice urged silence. The mother's soft sobs expected anyway. The child whimpered again, muffled behind a trembling hand. Silence was what they clung to, but silence was no shield. Silence was an invitation, and they had already accepted. He reached the base of the stairs without hurry, his head tilting unnaturally as he listened to the pounding of their hearts above. The others fanned out, their bodies gliding along walls and past doorways, as if the house itself were part of them now. The air grew denser, carrying a cloying sweetness like rotting fruit. Each breath of the family's fear painted the air thicker, a flavor he could taste on his tongue. He placed one bare foot on the first step. The wood cried out softly, a moan of surrender. He took another step, then another, unhurried, savoring the anticipation. Upstairs, the father shifted, trying to calm a child whose shivers were giving them away. The sound traveled like a beacon. The others below paused, their heads tilting to follow his progress, their smiles as wide and expectant as his own. The hallway stretched before him, impossibly long in the dim light, each door a potential haven for the terrified hearts that beat louder now, like drums in the silence. He could feel them through the walls, hearts pounding so hard, he imagined they might rupture from fear alone. One door at the end trembled faintly. Beneath it seeped a thin line of light, quivering as a small shadow passed hurriedly in front of it. His grin widened. The door's handle rattled, not from him but from within, a desperate hand fumbling to secure a lock too late. Resistance wasn't bravery, it was ritual. He raised his pale fingers and pressed them gently to the wood. It was warm with the heat of the family huddled inside. A single shove, featherlight, sent the latch clicking free. The door swung inward, betraying its occupants with a breath of warm, panicked air. The room was thick with the scent of sweat and salt, despair hanging like a visible fog. A weak nightlight illuminated the faces staring back at him, wide eyes glistening with tears, lips pressed tight to hold back whimpers. The father crouched in front, arms outstretched as though his shaking hands could block what stood at the door. Behind him, the mother clutched the infant tight against her chest, rocking back and forth in silent panic. A little boy, perhaps 6, hid behind her shoulder, his small fists gripping the fabric of her nightgown. The child's silent tears fell in steady rivulets, soaking her sleeve. His grin deepened as he stepped forward. The father didn't move, only whispered a prayer under his breath. The words meant nothing here. Prayers didn't knock either. The others arrived silently, filling the doorway, their presence suffocating. Together they watched, their hollow eyes fixed on the family's huddled forms, their grins twitching wider with each passing second. The room seemed to shrink as the air thickened, pressing inward like an unseen hand. The father's lips quivered with another prayer, but his voice cracked under the weight of the silence. The child whimpered louder now, his small body trembling uncontrollably as the shadows lengthened across the walls. It wasn't fear holding them still anymore. It was the realization that there was nowhere left to run. He stepped closer, so close the father could see the grin in full, see the faint cracks where flesh had split under the strain of holding such a monstrous smile. His hand rose slowly, one finger pressing lightly against the father's lips in a shushing gesture. The man flinched, but didn't move away. The room fell utterly silent. No sobs, no whispers, no prayers, only the sound of synchronized breathing, his own and the family's blending until they were indistinguishable. The others leaned forward slightly, their heads tilting at impossible angles, as though observing the final seconds of a familiar ritual. The child's sob caught in his throat. The baby stirred weakly in its mother's arms. The father's chest heaved in shallow, panicked gulps as his knees began to buckle. And then, with a voice like cracked glass sliding over stone, he spoke soft, almost gentle. "You don't need to hide anymore. You let us in." The second house tried harder. They thought they understood the rules, that silence and stillness would save them. Curtains drawn tight, lights out, doors bolted. It almost felt quaint, the way they huddled together in the dark, waiting for the sound they had heard every night prior, but there was no knocking anymore. Just a suffocating silence that crept up their walls, seeped beneath the door frames, and wrapped itself around their hearts. He stood outside with the others gathered at his back, their grins wide and patient, their heads tilting in unison as they listened. He could hear the father's frantic whispers, urging his family to stay quiet. He could feel the mother's fingers shaking as she held her child close. Every heartbeat was loud, panicked, unsteady, a chorus of fear too delicious to ignore. He raised a hand but didn't knock. Instead, he pressed his palm against the wood and waited. The others joined him, hands splayed across windows, siding, walls. A low hum rose from their throats, deep and vibrating, enough to make the glass tremble. Inside, the family clapped their hands over their ears, as though that could hold back the sound. But the hum wasn't in the air anymore. It was in the walls. It was in them. The house resisted longer than most. The symbols etched faintly. On the doorframe glowed briefly, as if trying to push back against the presence creeping closer. Salt crusted along the window sills, where hurried fingers had tried to draw barriers, but the grains began to shift and scatter with every pulse of the humming. The mother rocked back and forth in a corner, her lips moving silently as she whispered a prayer that grew more desperate with each passing moment. The father, clutching a baseball bat, crept toward the door with trembling hands, sweat dripping from his forehead. His courage wasn't born of strength, but of terror, the kind that forces movement, even when the body wants only to freeze. He placed his eye to the peephole and flinched violently. A single, unblinking eye stared back, set in a face split wide by that impossible grin. He stumbled back, dropping the bat with a clatter that shattered the fragile quiet. Outside, the humming ceased. Silence pressed in again, thick and absolute. The father turned toward his family, whispering to stay put, but the words caught in his throat as the door handle began to turn. It opened with an almost tender slowness, hinges sighing like something giving up the fight. The grin was the first thing they saw, emerging from the darkness beyond the doorframe, stretching wider as it came into view. Behind it, dozens more followed, filling the porch, spilling into the yard, their teeth glinting faintly in the moonlight. The father's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor, dragging himself backward on his hands and heels. The mother clutched her children tighter, her fingernails digging crescents into their skin. One by one, the figures stepped into the house, their movements fluid and silent. They fanned out, filling every room, every hallway, their grins flashing in the dim light. The air grew heavier, thicker, harder to draw into panicked lungs. The sound of the family's rapid breathing filled the space, mingling with the faint, wet sound of those grins stretching wider and wider. He stepped forward last, his head tilting as he took in the scene. The father whimpered, shaking violently as he pressed himself into a corner. But there was no more hiding, not anymore. The figures paused, grins fixed, eyes empty yet focused. He crouched low in front of the family, his two long fingers brushing the floor. The father pressed his hands together in prayer, but his lips wouldn't form the words now. The mother's eyes were glassy, tears streaming freely, her entire body trembling as she tried to shield her children with her own. A faint sob escaped the little boy, a sound that seemed to echo louder than it should have. The grin leaned in, inches from the mother's face now, and she tried to turn away, but the walls seemed to close in, pressing her toward the thing she feared most. In a voice too soft for its meaning, he spoke, not with anger or malice, but with certainty. You waited for the knock, but we don't need it now. You already let us in. The sound of dozens of voices whispered those same words in unison, folding over and over themselves until the air itself seemed to breathe them. The house fell silent again as they left, not because of what they had done, but because the house no longer held anything that could make sound. Faces peered from the windows as he walked away, their smiles faintly visible in the glass. They weren't the family anymore. They were something else now, joined, grinning, patient. The others followed him soundlessly into the street, their bare feet soft on the cold pavement. In the distance, more houses loomed in the fog, lined neatly like teeth in a jaw. Each one was silent, still, unaware of what approached. But silence was no barrier. The grin didn't knock anymore. It didn't have to. They approached the next house as one entity, a slow-moving tide of grins and hollow eyes. The sound of a television murmuring behind drawn curtains flickered briefly before cutting off. Shadows moved frantically inside as the family became aware of the presence at their door. He stopped at the porch, tilting his head like an animal scenting prey. The air carried the faint electric tang of fear. It was almost intoxicating. He raised his hand again, but this time didn't even touch the door. Instead, he whispered 3 words so softly, the sound didn't need air to carry it. "We are here." The phrase echoed faintly from every window, every pipe, every wall, until it pressed into the minds of those inside. They felt it now, a foreign thought, sliding beneath their skulls, curling tight around their memories. They didn't wait for the family to open the door. The barrier dissolved without resistance, melting away like wax beneath a flame. As the grin stepped into the threshold, the others flowed in behind him, their numbers swelling until the house seemed too small to contain them all. But the house didn't resist. No creaking floors, no groaning walls, no flickering lights, only acceptance. In the stillness, the grin felt their fear condense into something beautiful, like a held breath ready to exhale. They moved through the rooms together, patient, quiet, until every sound, every gasp, every sob, every heartbeat stopped. The 4th house resisted, not with locks or prayers, but with determination. He felt it immediately as they approached. The air here was heavier, charged with defiance, the kind born of desperation rather than hope. Salt crusted the windowsills, faint chalk lines circled the doorframe, and crude symbols had been scrawled across the siding in uneven hands. He paused at the edge of the porch, tilting his head as his grin pulled taut across his face. Behind him the others stilled, their unblinking eyes fixed on the flickering candlelight visible through the curtains. Inside, a family sat huddled in the center of their living room, encircled by candles and muttering in trembling voices. Their chants stuttered and broke, rising and falling like a failing heartbeat. The grin inhaled deeply, savoring the tang of fear still bleeding through the protective barriers. Resistance was admirable. It was also futile. He raised his hand, not to knock, but to press a single pale fingertip to the door. A faint hiss escaped the wood, and the chalk symbols began to crack and flake away. Salt shifted as though stirred by an unseen breeze. The others began to hum low in their throats, a sound that seeped through the cracks and coiled into the rooms like smoke. Inside, the father clutched a book of prayers so tightly, the spine cracked under his grip. He whispered faster, his voice breaking as the shadows pressed tighter against the walls. The mother sobbed silently, her hands gripping her children as if physical touch alone could anchor them to this world. The candles flickered wildly, their flames elongating, twisting unnaturally as the temperature plummeted. Each breath left mist in the air. The humming outside grew louder, vibrating the very floorboards beneath them. It wasn't sound anymore. It was pressure worming its way beneath their skin, clawing at the edges of their minds. The baby let out a sharp cry, and the candles winked out instantly. Total darkness swallowed them. The hum became a chorus of whispers, now layered voices spilling from every direction at once. You waited for the knock. You waited too long. The father screamed as the front door slowly creaked open, its hinges wailing like something in pain. The grin entered first, the faint glow of moonlight catching the wetness at the edges of his too wide smile. Behind him, dozens of others followed, spilling into the house like an incoming tide. The family backed against the far wall, their bodies pressed so tightly together, it seemed they might fuse into one trembling mass. The whispers grew louder, rising into a choral crescendo that made the walls pulse faintly, as if the house itself had begun to breathe. The grin crouched low, his long fingers brushing the floor as he moved toward them. The father thrust the prayer book forward, his voice cracking in a final desperate plea, but the pages began to blacken and curl in his hands, smoldering silently before crumbling to ash. His cries dissolved into dry sobs as he sank to his knees. The others closed in, their grins twitching wider, skin splitting faintly as black fluid dripped onto the carpet. The air pressed down like a living thing, so thick it forced shallow, gasping breaths from the family's lungs. The mother's eyes rolled back as she clutched her children tighter, her voice a weak, trembling plea for mercy. The grin tilted his head, observing them with something like curiosity, and reached out to brush the father's cheek. His touch left a faint, dark stain behind, spreading slowly across the man's skin like ink blooming in water. "You fought so hard," the grin whispered in a voice like splintering wood. "But fighting is only another kind of invitation." The whispers joined his voice again, echoing the words in perfect, terrible harmony. Silence fell abruptly as the family's breaths stopped in unison. The grin stood slowly, his smile unchanging as the others retreated toward the door, their faces pale and gleaming in the dark. Behind them, the house seemed to sag inward slightly, its walls groaning in relief. Faces pressed faintly against the windows from within, now their smiles glassy and unblinking. They didn't follow. They didn't need to. The grin and his companions melted back into the night, their bare feet whispering against the cold pavement as they moved toward the next house. The night air carried with it a faint echo of their chorus. "We are here. We are here." The further they went, the easier it became. Each house resisted a little less, their barriers weaker, their fear stronger. It was spreading now, not just through the streets but deeper, into minds, into thoughts, into dreams. Windows fogged before they even approached. Doors unlocked themselves. Families waited silently in the dark, clutching each other in paralysis, knowing without understanding that the knocking had ceased for good reason. He led them street by street, their numbers growing, their grins wider. In his reflection, visible in every puddle, every window, every glinting surface, he saw dozens of identical faces peering back, all grinning, all waiting. He felt no weight in his steps anymore, no resistance in his limbs. He was weightless, carried forward by something larger than himself. The town ahead was silent, no car engines, no dogs barking. No night insects singing. Even the wind had stilled. Street lights flickered faintly as he and the others moved past, their glow dimming as though shrinking away from the grins. House after house seemed to hold its breath, lights extinguished, curtains drawn, but fear had made them visible now, easy to find. He raised a hand and pointed to the next block. The others shifted as one, their movements soundless but heavy with anticipation. Together they pressed forward into the fog, their grins slicing through the dark like rows of gleaming teeth. No more knocking, no more waiting. They were inside already. The next block was waiting. He could feel it in the stillness, in the faint electricity crawling over his pale skin. Each house bristled with tension, windows fogged with the heat of frantic breath behind thin curtains. Doors quivered softly in their frames, as though aware they no longer mattered. He and the others moved in silence, a single entity stretching across the darkened street, their bare feet leaving no trace but a chill in the air. They did not need to speak. They did not need to signal. Each one knew their role, their movements as precise as clockwork. The town's lights flickered again, brief pulses of weak illumination before fading into darkness. One house dared to keep its lights on. A single living room lamp glowed faintly like a beacon of defiance. He tilted his head toward it, his grin widening so far now that faint cracks spiderwebbed across his cheeks. As they approached, the light winked out. Inside, the family crouched low in the center of their living room, arms wrapped tight around one another. They had heard the stories by now, neighbors gone silent, faces at windows where no one should stand. They had been waiting for the knock, but the knock never came. Instead, the air seemed to thicken until it felt like trying to breathe water. The father's lungs burned with the effort of pulling in even a shallow breath. The children whimpered softly, soundless cries muffled against their mother's chest. She rocked them with mechanical insistence, as though motion alone could ward off the creeping cold pressing against the walls. Then came the hum, barely audible at first, more felt in the bones than heard. It vibrated picture frames on the wall, rattled loose change on the counter. The hum rose in pitch, layered voices merging into one long droning sound that wrapped itself around every corner of the house. Their hearts pounded faster, harder, syncing almost perfectly with the growing rhythm in the walls. The door handle twisted slowly, a whisper of metal against metal that drew the family's gaze as one. The father clutched the poker from the fireplace, his hands slick with sweat. He didn't know why he bothered, didn't even believe it would help, but movement felt better than stillness. Behind him, the mother's wide eyes fixed on the hallway beyond the door. The hum stopped abruptly. The house held its breath. Then, impossibly soft and intimate, came the words, not from outside, but from everywhere at once. "We're already here." The father dropped the poker, his hands flying to his ears, as though to block out the sound pressing inside his skull. The words repeated, dozens of voices in perfect harmony, wrapping around them like invisible vines. The children screamed now, small and panicked, their voices muffled instantly as the mother pulled them tight against her. The door opened, slow and inevitable. The grin entered first, his movements deliberate and fluid. Behind him came the others, pouring into the house without sound. Their grins stretched impossibly wide, splitting the skin at the corners of their mouths, black fluid dripping in thin streams onto the carpet. The family couldn't move, their bodies refused, muscles locking tight, as though seized by some unseen force. Eyes darted wildly from one figure to the next, but there was no escape. no safe corner left. The grin crouched low in front of the father, his pale hand reaching out to rest against the man's chest. The heartbeat beneath his palm raced so fast, it felt as though it might burst. The father's lips trembled with a prayer he couldn't form. "No more hiding," the grin whispered, the words echoed by dozens of mouths behind him. "No more waiting." His touch spread across the man's shirt, darkening the fabric, as though ink was blooming from his fingertips. The children's sobs ceased in perfect unison. Their small bodies went slack in their mother's arms, eyes glassy, grins faintly twitching at the edges of their lips. The mother screamed, a raw, animal sound cut short as the grin turned his gaze on her. She froze mid-breath, her mouth still open, but no sound emerging. The others leaned closer, their faces a blur of smiles and hollow eyes, their heads tilting in synchrony. The house seemed to contract around them, walls groaning, ceiling sagging. The grin stood slowly, lifting his hand from the father's chest to leave a handprint seared black into the fabric. As he turned toward the door, the family rose with him, their movements stiff but obedient, their lips stretched wide, eyes unblinking. They followed him silently, barefoot on the cold floor. When the grin stepped onto the porch, the others spilled out behind him, their numbers now swollen with fresh additions. Faces that had once been familiar, neighbors, friends, children, now shared the same vacant eyes and two wide smiles. Together they filled the street, stretching as far as the eye could see, a river of grins gliding over asphalt and grass alike. Windows all along the block bloomed with faces peering out, smiles faint but unmistakable. They watched as more joined the procession, doors opening one by one to release new recruits into the quiet. No one screamed, no one ran. There was no need. They were already his. The grin turned his gaze to the horizon, where the town ended and another began. Beyond that, countless more. He felt it now, not just in this street or this town, but pulsing faintly in every neighborhood, every house, every bedroom where someone sat in the dark praying for silence. The others shifted beside him, their anticipation electric. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his pale hand and pointed forward. There would be no more knocking, no more waiting for permission. The grin was everywhere now, watching from every shadow, every window, every reflection. They began to move as one, soundless and unrelenting, a tide of smiles stretching endlessly into the night. The town ahead seemed lifeless from the moment they crossed its boundary. Streetlights flickered, but didn't stay lit. A few cars sat abandoned in driveways, their windows fogged from the inside, faint shapes pressed against glass, as if waiting for something or someone. The grin felt their fear long before he saw them. It clung to the air like humidity, heavy and oppressive. Behind him, the others swelled in number, a tide of faces and grins stretching across the asphalt. Their steps made no sound, their movements so synchronized, it was hard to tell where one ended and another began. Windows reflected their approach, grins staring back, impossibly wide, impossibly patient. This town hadn't heard the knock in days, but they had felt its absence. Families had waited in silence, clutching each other in the dark, praying for the sound they once dreaded to return. But the knock was never coming back. The grin didn't need it anymore. He was already here, inside one of the houses. A man sat alone, clutching a kitchen knife in both hands. Sweat dripped from his forehead, streaking down a face, pale with exhaustion and terror. The television had been his only companion. News anchors speaking in panicked tones about strange disappearances and towns that went quiet overnight. Then the signal cut to static 2 nights ago, and the knocking stopped shortly after. Now, all he had was the sound of his own breathing and the faint sense of being watched. He hadn't slept. Couldn't. Every time his eyelids grew heavy, he swore he saw it. The face at his window, pale, smiling, unblinking. It never moved, never spoke. It didn't need to. The smile said enough. He had tried to fight it at first, screaming at the thing, throwing objects at the glass, even covering the window with a blanket. But every time he turned around, the face was still there, staring through the fabric, its outline faint but impossible to mistake. Tonight felt different. He could feel them now, not just the one but dozens, maybe hundreds, pressing closer to his house. The air grew thicker with every passing second, harder to draw into his lungs. He staggered to his feet, gripping the knife so tightly, his knuckles went white. His heart pounded against his ribs, like a trapped animal. "I know you're out there," he shouted, his voice cracking with the effort. "You can't come in unless I let you. That's the rule." But deep down, he already knew the truth. There were no rules anymore. The grin tilted his head outside, his expression unchanged, as the man's cries echoed faintly through the glass. Behind him, dozens of others mirrored the movement perfectly. Their eyes were hollow, bottomless pools that reflected nothing. Not the house, not the man, not even the faint glow of moonlight. The hum began, low and resonant, vibrating in the earth beneath the man's feet. He stumbled backward, clutching his head as the sound pressed against his skull like a vice. The knife clattered to the floor as his fingers clawed at his temples. From every direction, whispers joined the hum, layered, overlapping, endless. "You let us in," they said. "You let us in." The man collapsed to his knees as the windows fogged completely, the shape of grinning faces pressing against every pane. The door handle jiggled once, twice, then stilled. There was no pounding, no splintering wood, just stillness. Then the front door creaked open with a sound like a sigh. The grin stepped inside, bare feet silent against the floor. Behind him, the others poured in like a slow-moving tide, filling every inch of the house with their presence. The man's screams were short-lived, swallowed quickly by the humming chorus. His body jerked once, twice, then went still. When his face tilted upward again, the grin had already begun to form. The procession moved on, leaving the house in perfect silence. From the windows, new faces stared out now, familiar yet hollow, their lips stretched in the same impossible smile. House after house joined them as they went, their residents stepping barefoot into the street to follow. The grin didn't look back. He didn't need to. Every face was his face now. Every eye saw what he saw. Every heart beat in perfect rhythm with the low hum that filled the air. The next town waited ahead, its streets empty, but its homes full of fearful eyes, watching from behind trembling curtains. The grin raised his pale hand and pointed forward. There was no need to knock. They were already inside. The next house on the street was no different from the others, its curtains drawn, its lights extinguished, its inhabitants clinging to silence like a lifeline. But silence was no shield anymore. Inside, a woman sat with her back against the front door, a kitchen knife clutched tight in her shaking hands. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, frantic breaths as she tried to calm her racing heart. Each sound in the stillness The creak of floorboards, the shifting of wind outside, felt like it carried weight. She had heard the knocking 3 nights ago, soft and polite at first, then loud enough to rattle the windows. She hadn't opened the door, not once, but the knocking had stopped, replaced now by something worse, the feeling of eyes on her at all hours. She had checked the windows, checked the mirrors, but found nothing except her own pale, terrified reflection staring back. Yet the feeling persisted, a pressure on her skin like invisible fingers tracing her spine. She whispered to herself, over and over, "Don't open the door, don't look, don't let it in." But deep down she could feel it. It wasn't waiting anymore, it was already here. Outside, the grin stood motionless at the edge of her yard, head tilted slightly as if listening. Behind him, dozens more crowded the street, their hollow eyes fixed on the house, their bare feet pressed soundlessly against the cold pavement as they waited in perfect stillness. Then, as if in response to some unheard signal, the hum began. It started faint, barely perceptible, but grew quickly into a vibrating resonance that made the windows shiver in their frames. Inside, the woman pressed her hands over her ears, rocking back and forth as tears streamed down her face. The hum wasn't coming from outside. It was seeping from the walls, from the floor beneath her, from the very air filling her lungs. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The knife trembled in her grip, useless against the thing pressing closer. The doorknob turned with deliberate slowness, metal scraping faintly, as if mocking her attempts at silence. She pressed her weight harder against the door, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. But her strength was no match for the force on the other side. The latch clicked softly. The door pushed inward. She fell backward with a startled cry, landing hard on the wooden floor as her knife clattered out of reach. The grin stepped inside, his too wide smile illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering through the window. Behind him, the others flowed into the room like water, finding every crack, every open space, filling it with their silent presence. The woman scrambled backward on her hands, her legs refusing to work as the grin crouched low in front of her. His eyes held no malice, no joy, only that endless vacant hunger. He reached out a pale hand, his fingers long and thin, and touched her cheek. The spot burned cold, a numbness that spread instantly across her skin. She whimpered as black veins began to bloom beneath her flesh, spider webbing out from his touch. Her eyes rolled back as her lips began to twitch upward, stretching unnaturally until her cheeks ached. The others stood in a wide circle around her, their heads tilted in perfect unison, their grins twitching with anticipation. The woman's body went slack as her breathing slowed. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, she sat up. Her eyes now matched theirs, wide, glassy, unblinking. Her grin was faint at first, but it spread quickly until her lips cracked with the strain. She stood and turned toward the door, joining the procession without hesitation. House after house followed the same rhythm: silence, fear, a door yielding to the grin's presence. Families taken one by one, their screams short-lived, their resistance fleeting. From each window new faces began to appear, smiling, unblinking, patient. The street filled with them now, a growing river of figures moving soundlessly in the same direction. Behind them, the houses sagged slightly, as though relieved of some heavy burden. The air smelled faintly sweet, like rotting fruit, mixed with cold earth. As they moved, reflections bloomed in every glass surface, mirrors, puddles, even the polished chrome of parked cars. Dozens of identical faces peering out, grinning, waiting. The grin led them further into the town, his pace unhurried but unstoppable. He could feel it now, not just this neighborhood, but the entire city ahead. It pulsed faintly, alive with thousands of hearts beating in fragile unison, all carrying the same delicious fear. Behind him, the others began to hum again, their voices merging into one deep, resonant sound. The vibrations traveled ahead of them, rattling windows, flickering streetlights, setting dogs howling before they fell silent. Families inside their homes pressed themselves against walls and closets, whispering to one another not to answer the door, not realizing the door had already ceased to matter. The grin tilted his head back slightly and inhaled deeply. The taste of fear filled him like a rich, cloying smoke. One block over, a teenager peered out from behind heavy curtains, his phone gripped tightly in trembling hands. He had been texting friends all night, messages that went unanswered after the first few hours. Now his screen showed only failed sends and static lines cutting across the display. He dared to peek through the curtains and froze. The street was full of them, pale figures standing shoulder to shoulder, heads tilted, their grins wide enough to split skin. Their eyes turned toward him as one. The teenager stumbled back, nearly dropping his phone as he fell against the wall. He pressed his hands over his mouth to muffle a cry, but it was too late. He could feel them now, not outside the house, inside. The teenager's breaths came fast and shallow, his chest tightening as he stumbled backward into the hallway. His phone slipped from sweaty fingers and clattered against the hardwood floor, the screen splintering with a spiderweb of cracks. He didn't dare pick it up. Somewhere upstairs, his mother's voice whispered his name, a sound so faint he almost missed it over the pounding of his own heart. He pressed himself against the wall, straining to listen, but the voice didn't come again. His mind screamed at him to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there. But his legs wouldn't respond. His body felt foreign, heavy, as if the air itself had solidified around him. From the living room he heard it now. A faint hum, low and resonant, vibrating through the floorboards like an approaching train. His eyes darted toward the staircase, just as the first pale fingers curled around the banister. The grin emerged from the shadows of the hallway, his face impossibly still, eyes unblinking, lips stretched in a grotesque parody of joy. Behind him, more followed, dozens of them, their grins twitching faintly, their movements perfectly synchronized. The teenager tried to scream, but his throat constricted as though an unseen hand had wrapped tight around it. His legs buckled, and he sank to the floor, tears streaming freely down his cheeks. The grin tilted his head at the boy, his gaze empty of malice or mercy. Slowly, he crouched low, his long fingers brushing the floor as he drew closer. The hum deepened, pressing into the boy's skull like a second heartbeat. The teenager's vision blurred as black spots bloomed at the edges of his sight. His ears filled with whispers now, countless voices overlapping in a sickening chorus. "We see you, we know you, you let us in." The grin extended a hand, its pale skin stretched tight over thin bones, and brushed the boy's cheek. The touch was ice cold, yet it burned like fire. Veins darkened beneath the skin, spreading like ink in water as the boy's lips twitched upward against his will. He sobbed weakly, the sound caught somewhere between terror and surrender. Then his expression stilled, his breathing slowed, and the grin took hold fully. Behind him, the others tilted their heads in unison, their grins widening until faint cracks split the corners of their mouths. The teenager stood slowly, his movements stiff but sure. His tears had stopped, replaced by a glassy stare and a faint, twitching smile. He turned without hesitation and joined the procession as it spilled out of the house and into the street. More faces peered from windows now, their expressions frozen in terror. But terror was fleeting. Soon there would only be grins. The hum rose in pitch as the figures multiplied, their numbers swelling until the street seemed barely able to contain them. Each house they passed seemed to sigh softly as doors opened one by one, releasing new recruits into the river of silent smiles. Reflections of grinning faces bloomed in every surface, windows, car mirrors, even puddles of rainwater rippling faintly under bare feet. Further ahead, the air thickened with dread as the next block waited. This one had tried to fight back. Salt lines crusted along doorways, faint symbols scrawled in ash on garage doors, candles flickering weakly in upper windows. But resistance was meaningless now. The grin felt their fear like a scent in the air, rich and intoxicating. He raised his pale hand, and the others stilled as one. The humming ceased abruptly, leaving only the sound of shallow, panicked breaths from within the houses. "They're listening," the grin whispered, his voice carrying through walls and windows alike. Dozens of voices echoed him in perfect unison, layering over themselves until it felt like the entire street spoke as one. "We are here. We are already here." In one house, a man clutched a shotgun with trembling hands, sweat dripping from his forehead. He aimed it at the door, his finger tight on the trigger, but his arms shook so badly the barrel wavered. Behind him, his wife cradled their child, her eyes darting wildly to the shadows dancing across the walls. The whispers had entered hours ago, seeping from the cracks in the plaster, filling every corner of the home with the sound of countless mouths speaking at once. The man had resisted opening the door when the knocking began days prior. But now there was no knocking. There was no warning, just the slow, suffocating realization that whatever waited outside no longer needed permission. The shotgun fell from his hands as the air grew thick enough to choke. His knees buckled, his body trembling violently as he pressed himself against the wall. His wife's lips parted in a silent scream as the front door creaked open. The grin entered first, his steps soundless, his eyes fixed unblinkingly on the small family. Behind him, others flowed into the house like smoke, filling every room, every hallway, every thought. The whispers grew louder, until they weren't just sounds, they were memories, dreams, fears, twisting together until nothing else remained. "No more waiting," the grin whispered, his words echoed by countless mouths. "No more hiding." The street was no longer a street. It had become a river of bodies, a tide of grinning faces flowing silently beneath the dead glow of the moon. Doors stood ajar behind them, windows gaped open like hollow eyes, and faint echoes of humming still vibrated in the air. The grin led them, his movements slow and deliberate, every step sinking deeper into a rhythm only they could feel. Behind him, the others mirrored each tilt of his head, each lift of his pale hands. Entire houses emptied themselves now. Men, women, children, stepping barefoot into the cold night air. Their eyes were glassy, unblinking, their lips twitching faintly as the grins took hold. There were no more screams, no more resistance, only the sound of 1,000 hearts beating in perfect unison, their rhythm set by the hum that reverberated in the earth itself. As they passed, reflections followed, in puddles, in car windows, in the darkened glass of homes they had not yet entered. Faces stared out, identical and endless, their mouths stretching wide with silent laughter. Even the wind had stopped, as if afraid to disturb the stillness. The grin paused at an intersection, his gaze lifting to take in the horizon. A distant city skyline loomed faintly in the night fog, its lights flickering weakly. He felt the fear radiating from it already. Millions of minds restless in their beds, clutching at blankets and prayers, unaware they had been seen. Behind him, the hum deepened again, a sound like 1,000 voices breathing as one. In one house, at the edge of town, an elderly couple sat in their kitchen, hands clasped tight across the table. Candles flickered faintly between them, their faces pale in the dim light. They had barricaded every door, every window. Salt lines traced the baseboards, faint symbols chalked in hurried hands across walls and floors. They whispered to each other, not prayers, not plans, just words meant to fill the crushing silence. But silence wasn't safety anymore. The woman flinched as the hum began, so low at first she mistook it for her own heartbeat. The sound seeped from the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath her feet. It vibrated her teeth, her bones, until she pressed her hands to her ears and shook her head violently. The man's grip tightened on her fingers as the kitchen lights flickered once, then went out. The door handle turned with a soft click. Slowly, almost tenderly, the door creaked open. The grin stepped inside, his eyes fixed on the couple, with an emptiness so vast it seemed to swallow the room whole. The woman began to weep, her shoulders shaking as she clung to her husband. He pressed his free hand flat against the table, as though bracing for an impact he couldn't see. Behind the grin, others entered silently, their grins stretching wider as they fanned out into the house. The hum rose into a chorus of whispers now, dozens of voices layering over each other in perfect harmony. "We are already here," they said. "We've always been here." The man's lips parted in a final desperate protest, but no words emerged. The grin's pale hand reached for him, fingers brushing his cheek. The coldness spread instantly. His lips twitched upward as black veins began to bloom beneath his skin, spider webbing across his face and down his neck. The woman sobbed harder, clutching his arm as if to anchor him. But it was too late. His glassy eyes turned to her, his grin faint but growing. She barely managed to whisper his name before the grin reached for her too. The touch sent a wave of ice coursing through her veins, her body stiffening as her own smile stretched slowly into place. When it was done, the couple rose together, their movements synchronized as they joined the silent procession spilling into the street. Their candles guttered and went out behind them, leaving only darkness. The grin led them onward, past homes now hollow, and streets lined with vacant faces watching from every window. The town was gone, not in flames, not in ruin, just gone, emptied of everything it had been. Ahead, the city loomed larger now, its towers blinking weakly against the night sky. He could feel them, millions of minds turning fitfully in restless sleep, unaware their dreams had already been claimed. Behind him, the chorus of grins began to hum again, louder this time, shaking loose bits of plaster from the walls they passed. The sound carried through streets, through alleys, into bedrooms where people stirred uneasily and clutched their blankets tighter. They were beginning to sense it. Somewhere in the city, a man jolted awake in bed, drenched in sweat. His heart hammered in his chest as he stared into the darkened corner of his room. He had been dreaming again, the same face peering in through his window, smiling, unblinking. It had never moved, never knocked, just stared. He sat up, trying to shake off the image, but his stomach churned with dread as he realized the room was no longer silent. A faint hum vibrated through the floorboards, rattling the glass of water on his nightstand. He reached for his phone, but the screen was black, unresponsive. Outside, the street lights flickered faintly, then went dark one by one. He rose slowly, his feet cold against the hardwood floor, and moved to the window. For a moment, there was only fog. Then shapes began to emerge, pale, grinning shapes, stretching endlessly down the street. The city didn't notice at first. People mistook the silence for coincidence. The absence of distant sirens, the lack of late-night traffic, the windless air pressing heavy against their windows. But those who were awake long enough began to sense it. The way shadows seemed thicker now, stretching across streets and alleyways like living things. The grin felt their collective unease pulsing in waves. Each mind was a fragile candle flickering against the weight of his presence. Behind him, the procession grew impossibly vast, a river of faces spilling across highways and underpasses, their feet soundless against the cold pavement. Skyscrapers loomed ahead, their glass sides flashing faint reflections of hundreds, thousands of identical grins staring up at them. In one apartment tower, a woman sat cross-legged on her bed, clutching her phone in white-knuckled hands. She scrolled endlessly through social media feeds that had grown eerily quiet. Posts stopped hours ago, replaced by a scattering of frantic updates. Blurry photos of pale faces pressed to windows, captions pleading for help, then nothing. Now her screen displayed only loading symbols and error messages. The hum had started 10 minutes ago, faint enough that she thought it was the building's old pipes groaning. But it grew steadily, a low vibration that made the glass of her window tremble and her teeth chatter faintly. She didn't dare look outside. Instead, she whispered to herself, her voice hoarse, "Don't check, don't check, don't let them see you." But deep down she knew they already had. The first knock hadn't come, not for her, not for anyone in the city. It was as if the knocking had been a courtesy, a polite warning of what was now inevitable. The grin's reflection appeared faintly in her blank phone screen, though she didn't register it at first. When she finally noticed, she froze, a pale face, stretched lips, unblinking eyes, smiling back at her from glass that should have shown only her own terror-stricken features. Slowly, mechanically, her head turned toward the window. The grin was there, not standing on her balcony, not pressed against the glass. It was simply there, inside, occupying a space it shouldn't, its presence wrong in a way her mind couldn't process. Behind him, more faces began to emerge from the shadows of her apartment. They didn't knock, they didn't speak, they only grinned. The hum grew louder, vibrating her bed frame, her bones, the air itself. She clutched her phone like a lifeline and tried to scream, but her throat seized painfully. No sound emerged. The grin stepped closer, its eyes locking on hers. Her lips trembled, her jaw aching as an unnatural smile began to form. She shook her head violently, her tears streaming faster now, but her body was no longer hers. She felt her feet lift her from the bed, as if pulled by unseen strings. Her phone slipped from her fingers and cracked against the floor, its screen shattering just as her own reflection disappeared entirely. Outside the tower, lights flickered floor by floor before blinking out entirely. Faces appeared in windows. Moments later, hundreds of them, all wearing the same frozen grin. From above, The city's once bright skyline seemed to darken as more towers succumbed, their lights vanishing in synchronized patterns like dominoes falling in the night. The river of grinning figures moved steadily through the streets below, weaving between abandoned cars and flickering streetlights. They spread like a living shadow, soundless but inescapable. The hum resonated through skyscrapers and subways, through walls and glass, through every fragile barrier people had once thought would save them. Far across the city, a man sat in his car at an empty intersection, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His headlights illuminated nothing but fog, the beams swallowed by the dense air. He had been trying to drive out for hours, but every road led him back here, to this same corner, to this same silence. His radio offered only static broken by faint whispers that he swore repeated his name. Sweat pooled at the base of his spine as his eyes darted to the rear-view mirror. At first, there was only his own pale reflection staring back, wide-eyed and trembling. Then the grin appeared behind him, eyes unblinking, lips split wide enough to show too many teeth. He didn't turn, he couldn't, but in the mirror he watched its pale hand rise to touch his shoulder. The man's breath fogged the windshield as he sat frozen, his hands still locked around the steering wheel. The rearview mirror seemed to hum faintly now, the vibrations carrying through his spine. He dared a glance, and the grin behind him hadn't moved, its face still stretched in that impossibly wide smile, its eyes staring into his as though there was no glass between them. He wanted to turn, to face it directly, but his body refused. It was as though the air inside the car had solidified, pressing against his chest, stealing the oxygen from his lungs. The whispers from the radio grew louder now, rising above the static. "You've seen us. You've always seen us. You let us in." His knuckles cracked as he squeezed the wheel harder, his jaw aching from the tension of holding back a scream. The rearview mirror fogged slightly, as if from breath, only it wasn't his. All at once, the car lights cut out, plunging the street into darkness. The hum outside grew heavier, vibrating the asphalt beneath the tires. In the shadows beyond his windshield, figures began to emerge, not walking, not even moving, but simply appearing one by one in the fog. Pale bodies, unblinking eyes, grins that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. They filled the road ahead, lined the sidewalks, crowded the windows of nearby buildings. The man's throat constricted as tears welled up in his eyes. He pressed his foot against the gas pedal, but the engine only whined, refusing to turn over. The grin in the rearview mirror tilted its head slightly, and for the first time, the man felt its breath, cold and damp, against the back of his neck. Across the city, others were succumbing just as silently. Apartment buildings once lit with thousands of lives now stood black and hollow. In each darkened window, faint outlines of grinning faces stared out at the empty streets below. The hum grew louder, deep enough now to rattle concrete, shaking loose dust from ceilings and sending ripples through standing water on rooftops. Those still awake felt it in their bones, an ache that started at the base of the spine and crawled upward like cold fingers. In one high-rise, a young mother clutched her sleeping infant to her chest, rocking back and forth in a desperate attempt to block out the sound. She had stuffed towels under the door, taped blankets over the windows, but still she felt their eyes on her. Every surface seemed to hold a reflection now, and in each one, faintly, a grin watched her with patient hunger. She hadn't heard knocking. There was no polite warning, no rhythmic tapping against the glass, just stillness at first. then whispers, then the hum. Now she couldn't even remember when it had started. It felt as though it had always been there, pressing against her skin, vibrating in her teeth, wrapping around her mind like a cold fog. She dared a glance toward the covered window and swore she saw movement behind the blanket. A faint indentation, as though a face pressed against the fabric, smiling. The baby stirred in her arms, whimpering softly before going still again. The hum deepened further, and she felt her lips twitching. No, she clamped her mouth shut, shaking her head violently, tears streaking her face. But her jaw ached, as if some invisible hand forced it open. Slowly, agonizingly, her lips stretched upward until her cheeks cracked. In the streets below, the procession thickened. The grin led them with unhurried precision, his pale hands at his sides, his glassy eyes reflecting the city's last faint lights. Behind him, thousands followed, some barefoot and slack-jawed, others still dressed in pajamas or work clothes, their grins twitching faintly. As they passed, more joined without hesitation, stepping out from doorways and alleys, their eyes glassy and unseeing. Reflections multiplied across every surface, cars, windows, pools of rainwater, until it was impossible to tell where the grins ended and the world began. The city was falling silently, street by street, as if being consumed by a living shadow. Far above, a man sat alone in a skyscraper office, staring blankly at the rows of monitors before him. Security feeds flickered, showing corridors and stairwells slowly filling with pale, grinning figures. His hand hovered over the building's lockdown controls, but he couldn't bring himself to press the button. Something about the screens hypnotized him. On each, the grin's face appeared faintly, superimposed over static and camera noise. His ears rang with whispers now, so soft they could have been his own thoughts. "We are already here," they said, over and over, until he felt the words vibrating in his teeth. His reflection in the dark monitor began to smile. The hum was deafening now. It pulsed through the concrete and steel of the city, like a second heartbeat, syncing with millions of fragile ones inside bedrooms and offices and cars. It left no corner untouched. It didn't need to break down doors anymore. It didn't need to knock. It was inside already, inside walls, inside mirrors, inside minds. And as the grin led its ever-growing tide of faces deeper into the heart of the city, there was only one certainty left. No one could stop smiling. The hum settled into a rhythm that felt almost like breathing, slow, deep, patient. Those still awake heard it vibrating in their walls, beneath their floorboards, even in the water running faintly through their pipes. But no one dared speak of it aloud anymore. Speaking made it real, and real meant there was no more escape. In one small apartment, a man sat with his back against the bathroom door, his knees drawn tightly to his chest. He'd stuffed towels into every gap around the frame, covered the mirror with a bedsheet, and unplugged every device with a screen. But it didn't matter. He could still see faint shapes moving in the darkness around him, pale, smiling faces lingering where light didn't reach. His phone, left face down on the counter, vibrated suddenly. He ignored it at first. Then it vibrated again and again. Finally, with a shaking hand, he picked it up and turned it over. The screen flickered to life, showing a message in bold white letters, "You let us in." The words scrolled upward as more lines appeared beneath them, thousands of identical messages flooding the screen, until his vision blurred. He threw the phone across the room with a strangled cry, watching it shatter against the tiled floor. The sound of the hum rose instantly in response, echoing so loudly, he pressed his hands over his ears. From the corner of his eye, he saw the bedsheet over the mirror twitch slightly, as if something pressed against it from the other side. A faint outline of a face began to form beneath the fabric. Lips parted in an unchanging grin. Eyes stared without blinking. He shut his eyes tight, whispering to himself, "It's not real. It's not real." But the whisper in his ear finished the thought for him. We are real. Elsewhere, entire buildings succumbed at once. Towering glass offices went dark floor by floor, their once busy windows now reflecting nothing but rows of pale, smiling faces. Subways fell silent as trains screeched to a halt mid-tunnel. Passengers sat motionless in the flickering light, their eyes wide and vacant as faint grins began to spread across their faces. Screens on the walls meant to show arrival times now flashed only a single message: already here. No alarms sounded, no one screamed. The change was quiet, efficient, as if rehearsed countless times in countless cities before this one. In the streets above, the river of bodies flowed endlessly, grinning figures streaming around parked cars and street lamps like water, obeying some unseen gravity. In one house at the edge of town, a girl huddled under her bed with her younger brother. They'd been hiding for hours, listening as the whispers grew louder, and the humming vibrated the wood above their heads. The boy clutched a stuffed animal to his chest, his lips pressed tightly together to keep from crying out. The girl held a hand over his mouth, shaking her head when his wide eyes pleaded for answers she didn't have. Neither of them had seen the grin directly, not yet, but they both felt it. The air was thick now, heavy enough to make their lungs ache. Shadows on the walls shifted without cause, growing longer, even though no light moved to cast them. Then, without warning, the bed above them creaked. A weight settled on the mattress. Bare feet dangled in their view, toes pale and motionless. Slowly the humming rose, and the siblings' hearts raced faster. Syncing perfectly with the sound, the girl's hand began to tremble as her lips quivered. She fought to keep her mouth closed, but her jaw ached as if pulled by invisible strings. She wanted to resist, she wanted to fight, but the hum was inside her now, coiling through her thoughts like a living thing. Her brother whimpered softly before his mouth began to curl upward, his tiny cheeks twitching against the strain of the spreading grin. The girl shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face as she felt her own lips betray her. The humming grew deafening, a resonance so deep it felt like her bones were vibrating apart. Then a voice, low, layered, endless, filled the small space. "We see you. We know you. You let us in." Outside, the grin stood at the center of an intersection, his pale face tilted upward as though tasting the air. The tide of figures behind him had grown vast beyond counting, stretching in all directions as far as the eye could see. Every step they took was perfectly silent, perfectly synchronized. Glass windows on every building reflected, not just one grin, but hundreds, thousands layered over each other like an infinite hall of mirrors. The city's skyline flickered faintly, its lights fading section by section. The hum deepened again, shaking the streets like an approaching storm. The grin lowered his gaze toward the largest tower ahead and began walking. The others followed without hesitation, their faces stretched in that same patient, terrible smile. In a luxury penthouse at the top of that tower, a woman sat by the window staring down at the grid of darkened streets below. She had watched the lights fail one by one, each blackout punctuated by a faint vibration that rattled the glass. At first she had thought it was an earthquake. Now she wasn't sure the earth could produce a sound like this. Her phone buzzed weakly on the table beside her. She didn't pick it up. The screen flashed once, twice before a faint outline appeared in its reflection, a face grinning impossibly wide. She turned her head slowly toward the window. In the glass, another face stared back. Not hers, not human, and it was already inside. The penthouse grew colder as the woman watched the grin move below. Its pale face tilted upward, as though sensing her gaze, and for a moment she swore its glassy eyes locked directly onto hers. She stumbled back from the window, heart hammering so violently she thought her ribs might crack. Behind her the whispers began. Not faint anymore, not confined to her mind. They filled the room like a low chorus of voices, layered and endless, spilling from the walls and the mirror, and even the polished chrome of the refrigerator door. We are here. We are already here. We've always been here. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the sound only grew louder, reverberating through her bones. Slowly she turned toward the mirror in the hallway. Her own reflection smiled back, its lips twitching faintly before curling upward into a grin that wasn't hers. Outside, the grin raised his hand, and the endless procession stilled as one. A silence more suffocating than any sound settled over the city. Street lights flickered once, twice, then died entirely. Windows went dark in perfect sequence, floor by floor, tower by tower, until the skyline became a jagged silhouette against the starless sky. For a moment, the entire city seemed to hold its breath. Then, as if on some unheard cue, every reflection came alive at once. In car mirrors, puddles, phone screens, and shards of broken glass, pale faces stared outward, grinning with impossible patience. Millions of them. In one apartment building, a man clutched his young daughter to his chest, rocking her as he whispered promises he couldn't keep. They had barricaded themselves in the bathroom, the only place left without windows. But even here, faint ripples moved across the surface of the toilet water, forming patterns too deliberate to be random, smiling faces that stared upward as though waiting to emerge. The hum filled the small space now, low enough to make his vision blur. His daughter whimpered softly against his shoulder before her lips twitched upward in a tiny broken smile. He sobbed, pressing her tighter to him as he felt his own jaw begin to ache. His teeth ground together with unnatural force, as if trying to hold back the inevitable. But the whispers slipped through anyway. Smile for us. Smile and let us in. Elsewhere, an office worker huddled beneath her desk as the lights flickered and went out. She had survived the initial wave by sheer chance, too late at work to be home when the first faces appeared in windows, too stubborn to leave when the streets outside went silent. But she felt them now, waiting in the shadows just beyond the glass walls of her building. She pressed her hands over her mouth to stifle a sob, as a faint tapping echoed nearby. It wasn't knocking, it was fingers drumming lightly against the polished floor, moving closer, pausing, then starting again. A shape shifted in the reflection of her darkened computer screen, long pale fingers stretching into view, followed by a too wide smile that never blinked. Her heart thudded painfully as she realized it wasn't outside anymore. It never had been. The city's skyline had fully died now. Every window, every reflective surface had been claimed. In the distance, faint lights glimmered along the horizon, distant towns and suburbs, still oblivious to what was coming, but not for long. The grin raised his other hand, and the humming deepened, stretching into a sound so low it rattled loose tiles from rooftops and set off distant car alarms before silencing them just as abruptly. Those still awake in their beds clamped their hands over their ears as their eyes began to water and blood vessels burst faintly in the whites. But even then, their lips twitched upward. Even then, they began to smile. On a deserted highway just outside the city limits, a family sat in their car, too terrified to drive forward, too terrified to turn back. The father gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white as sweat dripped from his brow. His wife clutched their son in the back seat, whispering prayers under her breath. In the side view mirror, faint figures began to emerge from the fog, their outlines hazy but unmistakable. One by one, they appeared, dozens, then hundreds, walking silently, grinning, their unblinking eyes fixed on the car. The hum reached them next, vibrating through the asphalt, through the tires, through their bones. The father's teeth clenched as his lips trembled. He wanted to fight it. He wanted to save them. But when his mouth stretched into a grin that cracked the skin at its corners, he knew it was already too late. At the center of the city, the grin stood beneath a towering skyscraper, his pale face glowing faintly in the gloom. Behind him, the river of bodies stilled as one, their heads tilting in perfect unison as the whispers poured into every crevice of the city like water through cracks. "We are here. We see you. You let us in." The voices layered over themselves endlessly, rising and falling in a rhythm like breathing. And as the reflections multiplied, stretching outward into every window, every puddle, every scream, it became clear there would be no corner left untouched, no room to hide, no silence deep enough to escape the sound. The city didn't fall in screams or fire. It simply went quiet, swallowed whole by smiling faces that never blinked and never stopped watching. And so, the knocking has stopped, but the faces remain, smiling, unblinking, waiting. Across cities and streets, in windows and reflections, they watch, silent sentinels of a nightmare that no door can keep out. Perhaps you'll see one tonight. Perhaps it's already here, staring from the corner of your screen. If you're brave enough to keep going, subscribe for more unsettling stories like this, where history, horror, and the unexplained collide in ways you'll never forget. Don't look away. The next knock might be for you.